Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping into something called Radical Orthodoxy. It's a theological movement. Lots of buzz around it.
Right. And we're aiming to, get a handle on the core ideas, why they matter now, especially in this post-secular age people talk about.
And our main guide here is James K. Smith's book, Introducing Radical Orthodoxy.
Exactly. It's published by Baker Academic, got a foreword by John Milbank. Smith lays out the key players, the big themes, the background. It's a great map, dedicated to Grayson, actually.
Good source. So our mission really is to unpack this for you, the listener. Make sense of radical orthodoxy, where it came from, what it believes, why it's significant, without, drowning in academic speak.
Yeah, find those aha moments, the surprising bits.
Okay, let's start there. Post-secular. The book uses that right away. What does that mean? Why is it important for understanding this whole thing?
Well, the old assumption was society gets modern, religion just fades out. Right?
Yeah, secularization theory.
Right. Post-secular basically says, not so fast. Religion is still a really big deal. It shapes how people think, how societies work. It hasn't just vanished.
So radical orthodoxy operates in that world.
Yeah.
Where religion is still present.
Exactly. It engages directly with that reality, where faith isn't just some private thing tucked away on Sundays. It's out there, in the mix.
Makes sense. Now, this movement, it didn't just pop up, did it? Smith mentions conversations with, continental philosophy, critical theory, Tübingen, Cambridge.
Oh, yeah. Definitely not in a vacuum.
What was the atmosphere like in those places? What fostered this?
Well, you had thinkers, especially in philosophy, feeling a bit adrift, maybe. The old grand narratives, the big secular answers, they seemed less certain, like maybe they'd hit a wall.
It's a sense of dissatisfaction.
Yeah, exactly. A sense that maybe purely non-religious ways of explaining the world weren't enough. Radical orthodoxy kind of emerged into that space, offering a way to bring theology back into the center of the conversation about, well, everything.
And then there's this phrase, decolonizing the secular. That sounds provocative.
It is, yeah. It's a core idea.
What are they trying to decolonize? How is the secular seen as colonizing?
Okay, think of it like this. Radical orthodoxy argues that a lot of what we think of as just neutral, secular ideas about politics, ethics, reason itself aren't really neutral at all.
Okay.
They argue these ideas are often actually borrowed from Christianity, but sort of stripped of their original theological context, like ghosts of Christian concepts.
So these ideas then shape everything else.
Right. And because they're presented as neutral, they subtly push actual religious perspectives to the side or make them seem irrelevant. It's like a quiet takeover of how we're allowed to think in public. That's the colonizing force they're talking about.
Interesting. The book also calls it a radical guide for the perplexed. I like that framing.
Me too. It echoes Maimonides, of course.
Right. So what are the big perplexities, the big confusions of our time that radical orthodoxy is trying to speak to?
Well, I think it taps into that feeling of groundlessness.
Yeah.
Where values seem relative, meaning it feels hard to pin down. Traditional structures are dissolving.
Nihilism, maybe?
Or just confusion. Yeah, leaning towards nihilism, or at least the threat of it. So radical orthodoxy steps in and offers, well, it claims to offer a more solid foundation, something rooted in the Christian theological tradition.
Addressing fundamental questions like, who are we? What's real? How should we live together?
Exactly. Especially when we don't all agree on the answers anymore. It's trying to provide a coherent story in a fragmented world.
Okay, so moving into the specifics. The book describes radical orthodoxy as maybe ecclesial, school, movement, or sensibility. That's quite a range.
It is, and Smith uses that to show it's kind of multifaceted, not easily boxed in.
So what's the difference between those terms? What do they highlight?
Well, ecclesial points straight to the church, right? Its deep roots in Christian practice, liturgy, sacraments. It's not just abstract ideas. School suggests, a coherent body of thought, key thinkers, shared texts, a distinct intellectual approach like the Frankfurt schools or something, but theological.
And movement.
Movement implies it's dynamic, it's going somewhere, it has goals, people identify with it actively, it's not static.
And sensibility, that sounds more subtle.
Yeah, it's like a particular feel or way of seeing things, a characteristic approach to questions, a certain intellectual and spiritual posture. Radical orthodoxy definitely has a distinct flavor.
So it's kind of all of the above.
Pretty much, yeah. Smith argues it functions as all of those in different ways.
So if it's all those things, how do we pin down what defines it. The book tries to determine radical orthodoxy. What are the absolute core principles?
At its absolute core, I'd say it's the belief that Christian theology isn't just one subject among many, but the necessary starting point for understanding everything. Reality, knowledge, politics, culture.
So rejecting the idea that you can build a solid understanding of the world on purely secular grounds.
Exactly. They're deeply skeptical of that modern project. They see it as fundamentally flawed. Theology, for them, is the queen of the sciences, you could almost say, reclaiming an older idea.
That does sound radical in today's context. Now, Smith mentioned some really interesting, maybe surprising influences: baptized Delusionism, Reformed Thomism. Those sound like academic jargon.
They do, yeah. Let's unpack them a bit.
Please, quick version.
Okay. Deleuze, a French philosopher, quite postmodern, focused on difference, becoming, flows, not obviously religious stuff.
Right.
Radical Orthodoxy finds some of his tools useful for thinking about, say, reality as dynamic and interconnected, but they baptize it. They take those ideas and reframe them within a Christian understanding of God's creation and ongoing involvement. God as the ultimate source of difference and dynamism.
So using postmodern tools for orthodox ends.
Kind of, yeah. It's complex. And Reformed Thomism. That's about going back to Thomas Aquinas, the great medieval theologian.
Oh, Aquinas, I know him.
But reading him through a lens influenced by the Protestant Reformation, particularly figures like Calvin, it emphasizes things like God's sovereignty, grace, the fallenness of human reason apart from God.
So blending medieval depth with Reformation insights.
And critically engaging modern philosophy, yeah. It's a unique blend. They're trying to weave together threads that are often kept separate.
Fascinating. Then there's this other provocative phrase: radical orthodoxy has a history for philosophy or narrative, telltales, and malarkey.
Malarkey. Yeah, it's deliberately jarring, isn't it?
What's the point they're making there?
They're deeply suspicious of the standard stories we tell about the history of philosophy. You know, the ones that often present it as a steady march away from theology toward secular reason.
Okay.
They argue those histories are never neutral. They're always narratives shaped by certain assumptions, often secular ones. By calling it malarkey, they're flagging it as, well, biased storytelling that often marginalizes or misrepresents the role of theology.
So they want to tell a different story about philosophy's history, one where theology is central.
Precisely. A story where theological shifts are actually the driving force behind major philosophical changes, even seemingly secular ones.
And this ties into how they see modernity, right? Smith writes about beginning from the middle, the modern turn to nihilism. That sounds pretty bleak.
It is a stark diagnosis. They essentially see the whole modern project, the Enlightenment focus on human autonomy, the separation of reason from faith, the rise of the secular state as a wrong turn.
A wrong turn leading where?
Ultimately towards nihilism, towards a loss of objective truth, shared values, and ultimate meaning. Because in their view, by trying to build everything on human reason alone, detached from God, modernity cut off the branch it was sitting on.
So the very foundations became unstable.
That's the argument. It leads to a kind of emptiness, a lack of grounding for ethics, purpose, even reality itself.
Wow, okay. And finally, for this section, the book mentions specific universities: Cambridge, Durham, Villanova. Why are they important nodes?
These are places where key figures associated with radical orthodoxy have taught and worked. Cambridge and Durham in the UK were really crucial early on. Think John Milbank, Catherine Pickstock, Graham Ward.
Ah, the key names.
Yeah. And then Villanova University in the US has become another major center, connecting the movement more strongly to North American scholarship. So these places are like intellectual hubs where these ideas have been incubated and spread.
Got it. Okay, let's dig into their philosophical story more. Part 3 goes from Plato to Scotus and back. Starting with Plato. What's the significance for them?
Well, they really appreciate Plato's idea that the physical world we see isn't the whole story. That true reality, the forms, and especially the form of the good, exists beyond the material.
The idea of a transcendent reality.
Exactly. They see that as a kind of philosophical pointer towards the Christian understanding of God as the ultimate source of truth, beauty, and goodness. But crucially, they don't just stop with an abstract good.
They make it personal.
Right. For them, Plato's good finds its true identity in the personal God revealed in Christ and the Trinity. So it's appreciating Plato, but also transforming him theologically.
Okay. And then Duns Scotus. He's less of a household name. What do they draw from him?
Scotus is really key for them, especially his idea of the univocity of being. It sounds technical,
Yeah, a little.
But the basic idea contrasts with someone like Aquinas. For Aquinas, when you say God exists and a walk exists, the word exists means fundamentally different things, analogy. For Scotus, exists means the same kind of thing, just infinitely more intensely for God.
Like the same concept applies, just on different scales.
Sort of, yeah.
Yeah.
There's a shared concept of being. This helps radical orthodoxy emphasize God's connection to creation, the participation of creation in God's being, rather than seeing God as totally conceptually separate.
Okay, that makes sense. It bridges the gap more.
It allows for a stronger sense of God's immanence alongside transcendence, which is important for their emphasis on incarnation and sacramentality later on.
And the title says, "And Back." What's this return about? Why revisit these pre-modern thinkers?
Well, they believe that modern philosophy took a wrong turn, partly by rejecting or misunderstanding key insights from thinkers like Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, and Scotus.
So the return is about recovery.
Exactly. Recovering what they see as richer, more theologically sound ways of thinking about reality, knowledge, ethics, ways that were lost or distorted in the shift to modernity. They think these older sources offer resources to critique the present and imagine a different future.
A kind of resourcement, but for philosophy and theology.
That's a good way to put it, yeah. Going back to the sources to move forward.
Okay, which leads us nicely into their critique of the modern world. Part 4, postmodern parodies, the critique of modernity and the myth of the secular. We've touched on this, but what are their main targets? Secularism, liberalism, technology.
Yeah, these are big ones. They see secularism not as neutral ground, but as a kind of rival faith, often built on, as we said, hollowed out Christian concepts. It creates a supposedly empty public square that isn't really empty.
And liberalism.
They often critique its emphasis on the autonomous individual, abstracted from community and tradition. They worry this dissolves social bonds and leads to a focus on rights without corresponding responsibilities or a shared vision of the good life.
Kind of atomizing.
Yes, that's a good word for it. And technology. They're often critical of how it encourages a purely instrumental view of the world, seeing nature, even people, as just resources to be managed and exploited rather than gifts to be received.
A kind of disenchantment, maybe?
Very much so, a loss of inherent meaning or sacredness.
Now, the book brings in some contemporary thinkers here. Slavoj Žižek, Graham Ward, Mark C. Taylor. These aren't all RO figures, are they? How do they fit in?
No, not all. Ward is closely associated, but Žižek and Taylor are more conversation partners, maybe? Or even targets of critique sometimes.
So why mention them?
Well, radical orthodoxy engages with them because these thinkers also offer powerful critiques of modernity, liberalism, capitalism, sometimes using psychoanalytic or deconstructive tools.
Finding common ground in the critique, even if the solutions differ.
Exactly. Radical orthodoxy might say, look, even these secular or postmodern thinkers see the problems, the contradictions, the emptiness we're talking about. They might find aspects of their analysis useful, even while rejecting their ultimate conclusions and proposing a theological alternative.
I see. It shows the critique isn't just coming from a purely religious corner.
Right. It helps situate their critique within broader contemporary intellectual currents.
Then there's this phrase, divine creation, a secular heresy. That really flips the script.
It does. It's another example of their provocative reframing.
How do they see creation differently from, say, a standard secular scientific view?
Well, they argue that the very idea of creation, ex nihilo creation out of nothing by a free act of God, is fundamental. They believe that secular accounts that try to explain the universe without reference to God are actually missing the most basic truth about reality, that it's gift.
So a purely naturalistic explanation is incomplete.
What?
Or even a distortion.
They'd say it's fundamentally mistaken because it denies the world's radical dependence on God. To treat the world as self-sufficient or self-explanatory is, from their perspective, a kind of secular heresy against the deeper truth of its divine origin.
Which leads to this idea of the impotent autonomy of secular thought. What are the weaknesses they see? Why impotent?
They argue that when secular thought tries to stand completely on its own, detached from any theological grounding, it actually loses its power. Its ability to justify things like universal human rights, objective moral values, or even the intelligibility of the universe becomes shaky.
Because it's cut itself off from the source of those things, in their view.
Precisely. It claims autonomy, but it's an impotent autonomy because it can't ultimately ground its own claims or provide a compelling, coherent account of reality and human flourishing. It lacks the theological depth needed, they'd argue.
Okay, so given all these critiques, What does radical orthodoxy actually propose? Part 5 looks at possibilities for the post-secular. What kind of future do they envision?
It's not necessarily about creating a theocracy or going back to some imagined Christendom. It's more about uh, reinfusing the public sphere with theological wisdom,
How?
envisioning a future where religious perspectives aren't automatically excluded from discussions about politics, ethics, culture, science.
Right.
A post-secular future would be one where the secular assumption of neutrality is questioned and theology is recognized as a valid, even necessary, public voice.
So faith and reason. How do they see that relationship? Does it challenge the typical modern split?
Oh, absolutely. They completely reject the idea that faith and reason are separate compartments, or that reason has to be stripped of faith to be valid.
So how do they work together?
They argue that all reasoning proceeds from certain fundamental beliefs or assumptions, faith commitments, you might say, even secular ones. For them, Christian faith provides the true framework, the proper light, within which reason can function correctly to understand God and the world. Faith-seeking understanding and understanding enriching faith.
A much more integrated view.
Definitely. Reason isn't autonomous. It's fulfilled and properly directed by faith.
What does this mean for public engagement? For ethics, politics?
It means that Christians, they argue, shouldn't try to translate their beliefs into some supposedly neutral secular language to be allowed into the public square.
They should speak theologically.
Yes. Offer explicitly theological arguments for justice, for the common good, for particular ethical stances. Root their political and social vision directly in Christian teachings about creation, incarnation, redemption, the nature of the church.
Which sounds like what they call the repoliticization of secular thought. What's being repoliticized there?
They're arguing that supposedly neutral secular politics already is theological, or at least has hidden metaphysical commitments. So they want to make those hidden commitments explicit and challenge them.
Bring the theological dimension back out into the open in political debate.
Exactly. To show that political choices are never just technical or neutral, they always involve a deeper beliefs about what humans are, what society is for, what constitutes the good life. And theology has crucial things to say about all that.
Okay, let's shift focus slightly. Part 6 delves into something more. Embodied. Participation and incarnation, materiality, liturgy, and sacramentality. Why this emphasis on material?
This is absolutely central. Remember Scotus and univocity, it connects here. Radical orthodoxy strongly rejects any Gnostic tendency to devalue the material world.
Because God became incarnate,
Yeah.
material.
Precisely. The incarnation, God becoming flesh in Jesus Christ, is the ultimate validation of materiality. It shows that God doesn't just rule from afar, but enters into creation. And this leads to the concept of participation.
Participation, meaning
Meaning that creation isn't just separate from God, it shares or participates in God's being, goodness, and life in a derivative way. We're not autonomous, we exist in God.
And this connects to liturgy and sacraments.
Directly. If God engages the world materially, and if we participate in God, then the physical actions of worship, liturgy, sacraments like baptism and Eucharist aren't just symbols.
They're more than that.
Much more. They are seen as tangible, material means through which we genuinely encounter God's grace and participate more deeply in the divine life. They are where heaven and earth meet, in a way.
So the Eucharist isn't just remembering Christ,
It's a real participation in Christ's body and blood, uniting the church to him and to each other. These practices actually shape us, form us, into participants in God's reality.
That's a very high view of sacraments.
Extremely. It flows directly from their understanding of incarnation and participation.
The book also mentions counter-theology,
Mm.
difference in creation. What's that about? What's it countering?
It's countering views, both secular and sometimes within theology, that either make God too separate from the world, deism, or too identified with it.
Finding a balance.
Finding a balance. Right. It emphasizes both God's radical difference from creation, God is not the world, and God's intimate involvement in creation as its constant source. Creation exists because of God's continuous gift of being, highlighting both difference and connection.
And how do thinkers like Levinas and Marian fit in? The book links them to creation and gift.
Well, philosophers like Levinas emphasize the idea of the other who calls us beyond ourselves, while Marian writes a lot about the saturated phenomenon experiences that overflow our concepts and the idea of the pure gift that comes without expectation of return.
And Radical Orthodoxy finds this useful.
Yeah, they draw on these philosophical resources to articulate the Christian understanding of God as the ultimate other, who freely gives existence as a pure gift, a gift that always exceeds our grasp or control. It helps them talk about God's transcendence and generosity.
Okay, final section, part 7. Cities of God, cultural critique, and social transformation. This broadens the scope again. How does RO engage with ethics, economics, politics on a larger scale?
Based on everything we've discussed, participation, the critique of secularism, the importance of theology, they engage critically. They look at contemporary society and ask, does this reflect a true understanding of human beings as created participants in God's way?
And often the answer is no.
Often, yes. So they critique, for instance, economic systems built purely on profit and competition, arguing for models that prioritize the common good, solidarity, and gift exchange. They critique political systems that marginalize the church or operate on purely secular assumptions.
Which leads to the idea of a Christian social theory. What would that look like? What are its goals?
It's about developing a way of thinking about society that is distinctly Christian, not just a religious gloss on existing secular theories like liberalism or socialism.
Key principles.
Things like the inherent dignity of the person grounded in being created by God, the importance of community, especially the church, in forming virtuous individuals, subsidiarity, solidarity, a critique of unchecked state power and unchecked market forces. The goal is a social order oriented towards God and the flourishing of all creation.
You mentioned market forces. They talk about technologies of desire, church, state, market. Sounds complex.
It's about how our desires, what we want, what we value, what we aim for, are shaped. They argue that powerful institutions, the church, the state, and especially the modern market, employ various technologies, practices, narratives, rituals, advertising to form our desires.
Often in competing ways.
Often in competing ways, yes. The market trains us to be consumers, the state trains us to be citizens, often in a secular sense, and the church seeks to train us in the virtues and desires appropriate for citizens of God's kingdom. Radical Orthodoxy analyzes how these forces interact and often conflict.
And finally, they look at the church itself in this post-secular context. A church without boundaries. A church beyond Christendom. What are these questions getting at?
A church without boundaries points towards the universal nature of the church. It's called to transcend national, ethnic, and political divisions, united only by Christ. It's a challenge to any purely local or culturally captive form of Christianity.
And beyond Christendom.
That acknowledges the reality that the church in many parts of the world no longer enjoys the kind of cultural dominance or state support it once had, Christendom. It needs to learn how to be a faithful minority witness, engaging the world persuasively, not coercively. How does the church live authentically when it's no longer in charge?
Big questions for the future.
Huge questions.
Okay, wow. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. If we had to boil it down, what are the absolute key takeaways from Smith's book on radical orthodoxy?
I'd say, number one, a powerful, deep critique of secularism and modernity, arguing they're built on shaky, often unacknowledged theological foundations.
Okay.
2, a recovery of pre-modern philosophical and theological resources, Plato, Augustine, Aquinas, Scotus, to offer an alternative.
Right.
3, a huge emphasis on participation, incarnation, materiality, leading to a very high view of the church, liturgy, and sacraments as real encounters with God. And 4, a vision for social and political transformation rooted in an explicitly theological understanding of reality, aiming for a post-secular public square.
That's a good summary. What about something that particularly struck you or maybe surprised you digging into this? For me, it was that idea of secularism having these hidden Christian roots, this malarkey history.
Yeah, that's powerful. For me, maybe it's the sheer ambition of it. The attempt to offer a comprehensive theological account of everything, philosophy, politics, art, culture, in a way that really challenges the fragmented nature of modern knowledge. It's bold.
It really is. So for you, the listener, maybe wanting those quick insights, those aha moments,
Yeah.
why bother grappling with something as complex as radical orthodoxy? What's the relevance?
Well, I think understanding it, even just the basics, gives you a completely different lens for viewing contemporary debates. Debates about faith and reason, religion and public life, the nature of secularism, the problems of modernity.
It makes you question assumptions.
Exactly. It challenges the assumption that the secular viewpoint is the neutral or default one. It offers a rich, complex, and deeply traditional, yet also quite radical alternative way of seeing the world. It can really spark new ways of thinking, even if you don't ultimately agree with it all.
Definitely food for thought. Okay, final thought to leave everyone with. If radical orthodoxy suggests our modern individualism is maybe lacking, what could participation look like practically in building stronger communities today? Something to chew on.
A great question.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.